Hello Year 11. Today we're looking at question 3D. So we need to put this title in our book. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the consequences of the Munich Putsch of 1923? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge of the historical context. Remember, this is the essay answer. It's 20 marks. So our first task is to look at interpretation 2 again. So you probably agree with lots of things in interpretation 2. It makes the claim that the Munich Putsch was successful in the long term for the Nazis and had many positive long-term consequences for them. So you need to try to pick 2 or 3 quotes or points to agree with, then highlight them. Do that now. Okay, you should have found a couple of points in interpretation 2 that you agree with in terms of the long-term consequences being positive for the Nazis. So for example, the putsch enabled Hitler to catapult his scarcely known unimportant movement into headlines throughout Germany. It also allowed him to learn an important lesson that direct action was not the way to achieve political power, and it was necessary that he seek political victory by winning the masses to his side. And also, he decided to try and find political supremacy by legal means. So you should have an information grid like this, and this obviously contains some of the old knowledge you would need to support those claims made in interpretation 2 about the positive long-term consequences of the putsch. So I've highlighted the evidence that you would use to link with those quotes. So obviously the question is, how far do we agree with interpretation 2? And although we agree with quite a lot of the points it makes, we can make some arguments against it. So is the interpretation too optimistic? Is it too one-sided? So we've got to use the other interpretation to help us come up with a counter argument. It might not be a strong one, but you do need to consider alternatives. So again, with interpretation 1, try to pick 1 or 2 quotes or points to agree with, and then you're going to highlight them and obviously jot down your own knowledge to prove they too are valid things to point out. So again, on this example, I've now highlighted a few things that interpretation 1 claims are consequences of the putsch. And that's that obviously neither Carr nor the army were going to support his march, that 16 Nazis died, that Hitler was arrested and accused of high treason, and that he was imprisoned for 5 years. So again, going back to our information sheet, I've highlighted some of the information we can use to agree with those points made in interpretation 1. So now we've highlighted quotes from both interpretations, we've got some own knowledge to agree with interpretation 2 and to agree with interpretation 1, we can put our answer together, and it follows a very strict writing frame. So I would begin. There are many aspects of interpretation 2's view of the consequences of the Munich Putsch that I agree with. For example, the interpretation correctly points out that, I'd insert a quote here, and indeed, from my own knowledge, there is evidence to support this, and I'd explore my own knowledge. I'd then go on. The interpretation also quite rightly suggests that. I'd put in another quote, and then I'd follow that up with more of my own knowledge. I'd then move on to the counter-argument. However, interpretation 2 is perhaps too focused on the positive consequences of the putsch. Indeed, interpretation 1 suggests that, and then I'd put a quote from interpretation 1 about some of the negative consequences. And again, I'd use my evidence to back this up. Once I've done that, I can lead to a natural conclusion. So I could state, in conclusion, interpretation 2's view is valid in its assessment of the long-term consequences of the putsch, but I can then point out that it doesn't really explore any of the short-term negatives of the Nazi Party. So You need to use your preparation documents, you need to use your own knowledge, and you need to follow this writing frame and just write up this 20-mark answer.